You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and federally certified veteran-owned small business. I'm your host, Robert Bain, along with our producer, Chris Spangle. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact us at chris@leadersandlegends.net. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today. Now, I've been chasing Mr. Barone for a few years, and he doesn't even know it because I could never figure out how to actually get a hold of him. But today, a very special Leaders and Legends podcast. Michael Barone is our guest. He has authored, several books, some of which we will discuss. He has appeared on television multiple times for decades. He has written columns. He has edited, and he's influenced. And we want to talk about that. One of my all-time favorite conservative common sense thinkers and writers. Mr. Barone, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Well, you're very welcome. Thanks for that nice introduction.
So what sort of was the impetus for me to reach out to you was that I had read your book, Our First Revolution. Now, that's a book that he wrote about the Glorious Revolution and its impact on the American Revolution. It is superb, the best treatment I've ever read of that book. Mr. Barone, you've written so much about sort of modern politics and the political almanac and all those sorts of things that have educated people for decades. What made you write about the Glorious Revolution of 1688 in England?
Of course, I'm tempted to just say it's obvious. It's important, the great historian Thomas Babington Macaulay wrote about it in the 1830s and 1840s in what is still a very readable, though quite partisan book. It occurred to me that at the time that the events that we call the Glorious Revolution, a name that was proposed by the people that turned out to be the winners in this episode, of 1688-89, was a giant step forward for representative government, for guaranteed liberties, and for a foreign policy that is opposition to tyrannical hegemonic powers in Europe. And that those were very important things in American history as well. And it turned out that these events, which were primarily about who would be king of England, had a big effect on the North American colonies that would, 90 and 100 years later, form the United States, declare their independence and form the United States of America and adopt the Constitution. So I thought, well, I should write about this. I had written several volumes, about 20 volumes of the Almanac of American Politics, starting with the edition that came out in November 1971. I had written a book called Our Country, The Shaping of America from Roosevelt to Reagan. And as I look back on my various books, there's sort of a history of the United States written at different times and not in chronological order. And Our First Revolution is about the first things that were important. One of the things that occurred to me as I was contemplating writing this book is that the Glorious Revolution, which was the installation of William of Orange, William the Prince of Orange, and his wife Mary Stuart as King William III and Queen Mary II, replacing her father and his father-in-law and uncle James II. the Stuart king, was an important factor for the British North American colonies. We've had a whole series of now mostly departed great historians of the colonial era and the Revolutionary era. And one of the things that they tell us that in their accounts of how these British colonies became the United States is that that a very important role was played by the colonial legislatures that were set up under the various colonial charters and this. King James II, the Catholic king in a Protestant country in the 1685-88 period, was busy revoking the charters of the colonies and abolishing the colonial legislatures. That was in line with the sort of absolutist thought of the day. King Louis XIV of France, the great long-standing monarch, who in fact was a cousin not only of King James but also of King William and Queen Mary. They were more or less first cousins once removed. They were in the process of getting rid in France of the medieval legislature, the Estates General, which during Louis XIV's reign and that of his great-grandson Louis XV was never called into session. It was thought these were medieval things. They were inefficient. You couldn't really, it was modern to have absolutist government with one monarch basically making the decision. And so King James, for the most part, tried ruling England, Scotland, and Ireland without a parliament, dissolving the parliament that had been in session. And he also was abolishing the colonial legislatures. When William and Mary came in, they restored the colonial legislatures. Why was that important for America? Think about the patriots who served in the colonial legislatures: Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and you could name dozens more who had experience there. They had experience, which, by the way, the leaders of revolutions in the Spanish and Portuguese colonies in the New World did not have, of operating in representative assemblies under political rules, dealing with constrained resources, applying important principles to the practicalities of real life, the stuff of politics. And they had that kind of training, and that comes in handy, it turns out, when you're leading a revolution, when you're declaring your independence, you feel that in the course of human events it has come time that you must do that. When you're constructing a constitution, for a federal constitution, and also constitutions for the original 13 and then soon 14, 15, and so forth states of your federal union. And when you have a problem of how you rule a polity in which you have a diversity of religions in a period when Europe had been racked by religious wars within living memory of many people, at a time when you had diverse nationalities and people speaking somewhat in significant numbers different languages and things. So people with that kind of political experience were important. So I thought, well, this is something that Americans should know more about. And I was writing at a time of considerable political controversy. You read nowadays, most people say, well, why can't President Trump be kind of a normal Republican like President George W. Bush? Well, they were saying the same thing about President George W. Bush, his political opponents in 2006, 2007. And I thought it's something that was important to Americans as Americans, and that it had echoes of the kind of diversity and unity and diversity problems that we continue to have at that period and continue to have today. And it was interesting. The biggest boost to sales came when I appeared on Jon Stewart's comedy program. It appeared that Stewart had actually read the book. Apparently, he likes to read history books. And although our partisan views, I think, at that time were very different, he was a very appreciative reader and drew me out, and we sold a whole lot of books. And when I was told that we had an interview booked with Jon Stewart, but I'd have to fly up to New York for the afternoon and do the interview, I said, well, that's a lot of bother. I shouldn't bother doing that. It turned out that that sold more books and to an audience that might not have been acquainted with it, at least some members of whom might not have been acquainted with it had I not been on that program.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest is author and commentator, prolific writer of columns, Michael Barone. When I have other historians of this time period on the podcast, the American Revolution per se, it's Willard Stern Randall, and John Fairlane, and so many, Andrew Jackson O'Shaughnessy. I always specifically ask them about the Quebec Act. Now, as a
Central Indiana, Wish TV is now live on YouTube TV and Hulu Live, offering more hours of local programming than any other station. Search for Wish TV or look for CW8 on both YouTube TV and Hulu Live to find us. Watch local news, sports, and lifestyle shows live from Wish TV. You can still catch Wish TV free over the air or stream it live on WishTV.com and on the free Wish TV mobile apps. Wish TV, available in more places for the latest news, weather, and sports.
Catholic myself, I'm a little partial, to James as opposed to William and Mary. But you mentioned it a few minutes ago. How did the specter or the perceived threat of a Catholic takeover of Britain, how much did that influence not only what happened in the Glorious Revolution in 1688, but also what happened in the colonies a century later?
Well, you had a period, 1688 is a period, turned out to be roughly the end of a period, in which you had huge European wars, great devastation and killing, demographic decline over religion. And at least in the kind of history that I've had in the United States, the history is sort of the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation comes along, and it mostly prevails against the Catholic Church. Well, of course, that was true in most of the English-speaking countries, although not in the Kingdom of Ireland as it then was. But it wasn't true in Europe. In Europe, one of the things that was happening in the 17th century is that Catholicism, under the Tridentine reforms of the Council of Trent, which met between, I think, 1533 and 1563, Catholicism was on the move. It was regaining territory from the Protestants. The Protestants felt that they were beleaguered, and the absolutist monarchs of the day, in particular Louis XIV of France, as well as the Spanish monarchs and others, were operating as champions, they said, of the Catholic Church, and the idea, and they were tending to suppress liberties. And you had this, Louis XIV's grandfather had issued the Edict of Nantes in 1598 that allowed Protestant worship. Louis XIV revoked that in 1685, the same year that James II came to the throne of England. And suddenly these Protestants were saying, look, these Catholics are not going to allow us to have our own church, to be able to have freedom of worship, freedom of speech anymore. And we only have a few places, the Scandinavian kingdoms, some of the German principalities, and England, Scotland, and the Dutch Republic and the Netherlands, are solidly Protestant and believe in and allow worship in multiple forms. And of course, the Netherlands was even more advanced than England there. Who is the stadtholder of the Netherlands, the kind of military leader of the seven states that made up the Republic of the Netherlands, the Dutch Republic? Well, it's William, Prince of Orange, who is also in line, third in line for the British throne because he is married to King James's daughter, but he's also the son of one of King James's sisters. And as such, he is in line for the throne after William, after his wife, Princess Mary, and her sister, Princess Anne, who are both solid Protestants and definitely adherents of the Protestant church. William is very much a Protestant, in line with the Calvinist tradition of this majority of the Dutch Republic, though they have toleration of others, including Jews, interestingly. And they basically, William suddenly becomes a sort of champion of English liberties and Protestant things, and he uses the free press of the Netherlands to print up something called pamphlets. This is the internet of the late 17th century, printing up small pamphlets in the Netherlands. The Netherlands has all these presses that are churning out documents in all sorts of languages in the Dutch Republic. And then they're shipping them over to England, and they supply them in this new, previously unheard of form of network of communications, which is called the coffee houses. Starbucks was not the first. You had coffee houses in the 17th century in England, and the Williams forces, William has his operators in England setting up, distributing for free these pamphlets in coffee houses where people can read them and bring them to the attention of others. So this is a move. It's a rather daring move by William. He claims that he had a letter from 7 British nobles telling him to please come to England and to help settle some issues with King James where they're distressed about what the king is doing. He procured that letter. He basically operated under the theory that was widespread at that time that since he was a prince, the title Prince of Orange came from the Holy Roman Empire in the 16th century, and he had inherited it through a distant cousin, and so sort of happenstance way, he never actually set eyes on Orange, a city in the France, which is the name of his principality. I've been there. King William never was, and he had a right to come to England to assert his interest as an heir to the throne. And in 1688, William, King James, by his second wife, his Catholic wife, Mary of Modena, has a child, or so it is proclaimed, a boy who is going to who will take the line of succession away from Princess Mary and Princess Anne.
Mr. Barone, did you just say, forgive me, did you just say so it was proclaimed? I find that delightful as an oblique reference to the warming pan baby, as it was proclaimed. Do you think that?
Well, they didn't have DNA testing at the time. I think most of the historians of the region believe that it was not smuggled in a warming pan. There were not as many witnesses to royal births then as there usually were. That was a little bit suspicious because, usually these women royals, they got the nicest dresses and everything, but when they gave birth, they had to have a whole bunch of people from the court in there watching them.
But your point is well taken, because there was not an uproar. So Restoration Charlie, comes back to the throne in 1660. He is the son of the murdered Charles I. He has 1 million kids, although none of them are legitimate, who live. And actually, my family, the Vane family, are directly descendant from Charles II and his mistress, Barbara
One of
Williams.
his.
One of his mistresses, point taken. But when Charles II died and James became king, even though he was Catholic, the country and the leaders accepted him. He was a fine warrior because he didn't have a son. But when Mary of Modena gave birth, reputedly, to a son who would be baptized Catholic, that changed everything. Is that a fair statement?
I think that's changed everything. In fact, what they thought, we have this Catholic king, but he won't last forever. And the Protestant daughters and his Protestant nephew and son-in-law are in line to inherit the throne. So we don't have too much to worry about. But suddenly the male child is born or is said to be born to the Queen in June 1688. And they say, we'll have we'll have Catholic kings forever. He'll be raised a Catholic, and they will be Catholic kings forever. And in fact, if you look at the line of inheritance, that son that was born and he had two sons in turn, illegitimate sons, the younger of whom lived until 1807. So that was 119 years of Catholic kings was a possibility suddenly. And in fact, it turned out if they had inherited the throne, it would have been about that many years. So this was a real upset. One of the things that I found kind of fascinating and interesting about writing about this period is that you have all these contingencies that are open depending on who inherits the throne. And it's not at all clear. And in fact, when you go through English-British history, of course, the genealogical claims of some of the monarchs there are pretty weak. I mean, the Tudors, and especially, who seem to have been intellectually the most gifted of the British monarchs, Henry VIII, his daughter Elizabeth I, and so forth. They're all real smart people. Their genealogical claim was laughably weak. And you have
Welsh.
Yeah, well, you have Shakespeare writing plays to justify it and so forth, because you didn't want to, attain the legitimacy of the throne. But in any case, this was the William coming to England, landing in November in the English Channel in a flotilla of more than 50 ships with 25,000 troops, including Dutch cavalry, that are coming aboard in England and going from the southwest of England and proceeding into London. King James retreating, throwing the royal seal into the Thames River, going to the continent, and so forth, and going to France. This was a real upheaval. I think one of the ways that it helped to promote civil liberties and helped to promote freedom of speech was not only the immediate settlement, where the Parliament gets William III to agree to a series of changes that involve, among other things, Parliament meeting every year, the king not being able to spend money without Parliament, a toleration act that went farther than the toleration acts of the time in most of Europe, religious toleration, and so forth. But you also had a period in England from 1689 until 1760 where there was some doubt about the legitimacy of the monarch, of the legitimacy of who was in charge of the system. You had armed rebellions by advocates of King James's sons, son and grandson, in 1715 and 1745. You got troops into England at that point, landing in Scotland, coming to the south. You had, and basically, the way the English handle this, and the Scots and the Irish to considerable extent, is that instead of killing each other and slaughtering each other the way that happened so much in the religious wars of the 16th and 17th century, in England in their Civil War and on the continent in a variety of other wars, they kind of tolerate each other. They get used to political arguments and so forth. And this also goes in the colonies, where a lot of the arguments that were made against the Protestants who upheld the succession of William and Mary were then applied by the patriots, those who were rebelling against the actions of the king or the king in parliament on the taxes of the 1760s and declaring independence in 1776 and fighting the Revolutionary War in the 70s and 80s and securing independence recognition by Britain of independence in 1783, writing Constitution in 1787. This all happens in an atmosphere of tolerance for people that are asserting legitimate claims to power and an ability to get together and live together, mostly peacefully, which contributes to the success, although it was limited at sometimes, and we did have a civil war, to the success of the enterprise of the United States of America.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest is noted author, commentator, Michael Barone. He graduated from Harvard College in 1966, and he earned a law degree from Yale Law School in 1969. I mention that only because my son is studying for the bar at this very moment. Was there anyone at especially Yale Law School in 1969 who we would know today? Anybody famous you hung out with?
Well, President Clinton and the First Lady and Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton were at Yale Law School, but did not overlap in time with me. She entered the law school in 1969. Except in the fall, I had graduated in the spring, and President Clinton entered, I think, in 1970. They graduated in 1973. So, I was present in the Gothic library of the sort of wonderful Gothic 1930s buildings of Yale Law School, the quad there, in that library with its huge ceiling and everything, where Bill and Hillary Clinton first met. But that was several years before they were ever on the premises. So I didn't. Well, we had the graduating class 2 years before me, 1967, produced two presidential candidates, the late Paul Tsongas and the late Joe Lieberman, were both members of that class, all together with the very gifted political commentator and television pundit and author Jeff Greenfield.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Kept in touch over the years. Yeah, Jeff Greenfield, who then became one of the two leading speechwriters for Robert Kennedy in his 1968 presidential candidate. So he was actually involved in a major presidential candidacy within a year of graduating from Yale Law School. We had Jerry Brown and Gary Hart had graduated from that law school in 1964, which was not so long before, and they became young, nationally important political leaders in the 1970s. Pretty quick.
I should also, forgive me, I should also mention that former Indiana Chief Justice Randall Shepard graduated from Yale Law School at about the same time. I think he was there actually with the Clintons.
Okay, in the 70s. Well, that was after my time. So, I took antitrust from Robert Bork, and we had Guido Calabrese, who was longtime judge on the Second Circuit, is still alive and kicking. It had him for torts. So it was an enterprise where a lot of people that had subsequent careers were part of things. The founders of some of the big environmental law non-governmental organizations were in my class and the class of 1970.
Now, is it fair to say that you became prominent or more prominent as a conservative commentator, or at least labeled as such? But my research shows that you voted for George McGovern in 1972.
Oh, sure. I was a liberal Democrat. I had been for President Kennedy in 1960 when I was in a high school that was 90% Republican in a private school in Bluefield Hills, Michigan. And so then I became a member of the press corps, and I became a Republican in an institution that was 90% Democratic. So perhaps that just represents a certain amount of orneriness or instinct towards taking the what is in the milieu in which I'm operating, the minority view, and finding it attractive. I worked for the mayor of Detroit in the summer of 1967, and when we had the riot in Detroit, and so I was at the side of the mayor of Detroit and Governor Romney of Michigan. That's not Mitt Romney, but who was 3 years behind me in high school, but George Romney, who was born in 1907. I basically say, well, we tried out that liberal democratic politics, and it didn't work so well, and so we tried something else.
Were you ever able to discuss these switches with one of my previous guests who was so kind to come on was Leon Panetta, who started out as a Republican and working for Nixon and then changed. Did you ever talk to Mr. Panetta about how both of you embraced the other side?
No, I never had that conversation with Leon Panetta. I spent some time with him because I used to go up to the Capitol Hill and hang around, the members, the House, the Speaker's lobby and things where, you'd get John Boehner, who was Speaker, and before that, I had to come in and have a cigarette often, and so you'd always get scoop from John Boehner. And, sure, talk to the Leon Panetta, lots of members of Congress. It's people change their minds about things. You learn from experience. You get different things. I mean, in 1990, I had published this book, Our Country, The Shaping of America, from Roosevelt to Reagan. And one of the things that I noted, I think, in that book, and Pat Moynihan and I, who endorsed the book, and George Will, I think, both recognize this also, there's a certain amount of continuity with Roosevelt and Reagan. I mean, not only did Reagan vote for Roosevelt 4 times, switching party and changing his mind on some issues later, but there's also a certain amount of continuity. They favored the kind of foreign policy that William of Orange favored, which was opposing the continental hegemon tyrannical power in the European hemisphere, which in William of Orange's case was Louis XIV, in President Roosevelt's case was Hitler, in the case of Reagan, and also about Democrats, including President Truman, was the Soviet Union. There's a certain amount of friendliness towards free trade and immigration on the part of Reagan, unlike the current Republican president, who has taken from his initiation into public issues in circa 1970s different views on those subjects pretty consistently. But I think there's a certain amount of continuity, and of course, as I have mentioned to you and many others, the Reagan's line in the 1980 presidential debate with President Carter, "Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?" He says the thing is a direct steal from Franklin Roosevelt, who uses another formulation of that line in the run-up to the 1934 congressional elections. Are you better off than you were 2 years ago? Or are you more able to buy food and clothing for your family and so forth? That was only 46 years before 1980, and President Reagan, either remembered or subliminally recalled that statement by Roosevelt and applied it in a situation where it worked to his benefit and advantage. So, I think there was a certain amount of continuity there, even though they're different parties. One tended to favor expansion of government. The other tended to be skeptical of it, if not skinning it back, although it did in some areas. But, those were similarities. And I think the opposition to hegemonic tyranny, I think, is an important thing. It's an important reason I wrote this book, Our First Revolution, about the glorious revolution of 1688-89, because it seems that William of Orange's great motive for basically seizing the British thrones of England, they were separate thrones there, England, Scotland, and Ireland, where he does military operations in Scotland and Ireland as well as in England. It was opposition to this power of Louis, in his view, tyrannical power of Louis XIV, who was his cousin as well, in Europe, and this domination of most of Europe. And you see that theme coming up again and again. It comes up in the successor to King William as British monarch. His sister-in-law, Princess Anne, becomes Queen Anne. She hires as one of her chief generals, John Earl of them becomes Duke of Marlborough, John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough. And he prosecutes the war against Louis XIV with great success and seizes in 1705, of course, 1704-05, he wins the Battle of Blenheim, seizes a French army, a Marshal of France, 80,000 French troops in southern Germany, the Battle of Blenheim. And Queen Anne awards him in retrospect for that, she makes him Duke of Marlborough. She awards him a property, the Woodstock Manor outside of Oxford, a big piece of property, and £250,000 to build a house there, and that becomes Blenheim Palace, which you can visit today under the current Duke of Marlborough, and in which Winston Churchill was born. And Britain continues to oppose the great hegemonic power of revolutionary and Napoleonic France 100 years later. And then 200 years later, we get the descendant of John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, a man named Winston Churchill as Prime Minister of Britain, and a descendant of the Dutch patroon settlers of the Hudson Valley, Franklin Roosevelt, aiding him in those terrible years in 1940 when Hitler and Stalin are allies under the Hitler-Stalin Pact. They're in control after Hitler's victory over France. They're in control of most of the landmass of North America, of Eurasia. There's no way to get them out of that kind of control. It is the nightmare that inspires Orwell's 1984. And you have who is standing against it? Well, Churchill is, and he's leading Britain to stand against it. And Roosevelt is providing aid to Britain. And this is kind of a descendant of the time when William of Orange's troops are there, and John Churchill is leading King James's forces, and he comes over at night, gallops his horse over, and comes out on the side of Prince William, the Prince of Orange, against his patron, King James. This was, there's a reprise of that in 1940, when it seemed that the battle against evil totalitarians was mostly lost all over the world, and we stood against that. Now, today, I think that what I would call the Orangist or Churchillian legacy is not popular with the American people. It is not. It is something against which President Trump has often spoken. It's something against which most of the Democrats in Congress profess not to believe, and so forth. I don't think it's an appropriate role for the United States to play. My view is different, but I note that the English-speaking peoples, since the time of William, Prince of Orange, and John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, have led battles against hegemonic tyrannical powers. The support for such enterprises among English-speaking peoples has waxed sometimes, and it has waned. And we're in a period of waning, in despite of which President Trump has embarked on this enterprise of attacking the military power of the Iranian regime and expressing hope that its regime would be overthrown.
I'm going to go through some kind of quick questions here because I'm just fascinated by how you've been so active in the political world and as a historian as well. What is your first political memory?
My first, I suppose watching the 1952 Democratic and Republican national conventions on television. I mean, one of the fascinating things about American life is the fast proliferation of new media, television. In 1949, something like 3%, 4% of Americans had television sets in their houses. By 1952, it's nudging up to 90% have televisions. And I remember sitting watching, it seemed like all afternoon and into the evening, watching those televisions in those hot, unair-conditioned days in Detroit, where I lived then, and so forth, and being probably more interested in that than most kids. So I would read that. And, I would read, my parents subscribed to the Detroit News and the Detroit Free Press, a morning and an afternoon paper, and got Time Magazine, U.S. News and World Report. So I was reading a fair amount of political events going back into the 1950s.
What's your favorite political movie?
Political movie? Well, I'm not sure. I mean, what? Yeah, I went to the premiere in the Kennedy Center of All the President's Men, which is not a favorite of a lot of conservative writers these days. It's a pretty gala occasion. I worked with Peter Hart, the Democratic pollster from 1974 and 1981, who I continue to be in contact with, and his retirement, and continue to admire. I think that seasoned political reporters, including some that are no longer with us, would tell you that there's nobody in the political consultant firm who has more integrity than they, and on whose integrity you can retire, whose word you can you can depend on than Peter Hart. And I think that the record will show that. In 1981 to 89, I worked for. In 82 to 89, I worked as an editorial writer for the Washington Post. One of the editorials that I worked on, a rather short one, was about Jesse Jackson's reference to New York City as Heimtown in the 1984 campaign cycle. So I think that probably had more impact than any other editorial that I had worked on. But worked for the editorial page there. There's been a certain amount of controversy in the recent years about last year, 2024 and so forth, is Jeff Bezos changing the political philosophy of the Washington editorial page by saying that it should believe in free enterprise and America taking a positive role in the world. I think that the editorial page of the Washington Post can be characterized certainly in my acquaintance with it as a reader in the 70s, as a participant in the 1980s, and thereafter, a reader thereafter, of taking a positive role towards free enterprise and towards America taking a positive role in the world. I don't think that what he said is inconsistent. The Post has never been the kind of knee-jerk left-wing editorial page that the New York Times has been for the last 30 or 40 years, perhaps 50,
Right.
and so forth. So it's a much more thoughtful editorial page. Yeah, I think it is now. I think it was in the 1980s. It was under Meg Greenfield. It was under Fred Hyatt, who died prematurely in the decade of the 2010s. So I just put that out there.
Do you have a particular favorite Hoosier leader or legend you admire most?
Well, I'm tempted to say President Benjamin Harrison. I think I think we've had two good vice presidents in more recent years. We've had a number of vice presidents from Indiana, in Dan Quayle and Mike Pence, who have perhaps been underestimated by people. I wrote about Vice President Quayle while he was in office, and it did. I remember in the 1988 cycle when I was still working at the Washington Post editorial page editor, the editorial page editor, Meg Greenfield, said to me, she said, "You go do some research." She said, the Democrats are saying this guy Quayle is a rich kid, has millions and millions of dollars and so forth and everything. Find out the facts. I just hear all this sort of aspersions. And so I did a little digging and everything, and it seemed to me, as I recall, what I came up with is that Quayle had something like a trust fund that produced an income for his family for something like $8,000 or $10,000 a year at that time. Which, look, most Americans would like to get a little extra $8,000 or $10,000 a year, even with inflation today. You wouldn't turn that down, but it's not like you're living in the lap of luxury. In 1988, when I was growing up in the 1950s, that would have been quite a bit of money, but still, wouldn't have made you a rich person.
How dare Dan Quayle supposedly have the same sort of financial wherewithal as Ted Kennedy?
Well, right. No, I think each of them did in a tradition that was started really with Vice President Walter Mondale with President Jimmy Carter participating in a positive way of the vice president having serious responsibilities. And as vice president, you have to navigate, this thing of where, on some issues you will disagree with the president, but on the other hand, you really don't want to create a situation where you put up an incentive for people to sort of get rid of the president so they can get you in there to policies. There's an institutional reason for not wanting to have open disagreement between president and vice president. We're seeing that today with Vice President J.D. Vance, whose residence is in Cincinnati, Ohio, not too far from the Indiana line. And this can produce some awkwardness, but I think it's also produced vice presidents who have been well informed about the business of government and have therefore been in a position to step in and exercise the duties of the presidency in a way that's been pretty responsible, starting with Vice President Mondale, and I would include the vice presidents of both parties that have served since Vice President Mondale did so in the late 70s, 1977, 81. That's been a positive improvement institutionally, and it's mostly worked out.
We usually don't date our podcast. In other words, mention the date that it is being recorded because they're recorded in advance. However, excuse me. I would be remiss, especially given your age and your love of the time period. Uh, Today, May 4th, is the 56th anniversary of the Kent State shootings. If you have not read the book, Kent State, by Brian Vandemark, a leading historian of the time period, Vietnam, Lyndon Johnson, it came out a couple, 3 years ago. It is superb, and he came on the podcast to discuss it. Do you have any particular memories? You were completely out of college by May of 1970. Do you have any thoughts or recollections on what that day and its aftermath meant for the United States at the time?
Well, I have a memory of, what a horrifying event it was, and you had these people, uh, involved in a demonstration of political expression, who were shot by National Guard officers, and of course, we wish that hadn't happened. I was serving as a law clerk to Judge Wade McCree of the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit that covered Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee, and he was stationed in Detroit, which was my hometown, and during that 2-year period, and he met court in Cincinnati, and as one of the 2 law clerks, I would spend 6 weeks in Cincinnati several times a year in Ohio. So I was a kind of a close witness of that, if you will, but it was part of that period when, we think of the politics of today, 2026, as particularly
Right.
violent, and we've had attempted presidential assassinations, multiple, and of violence around the country, and so forth, and we have had some of that. Numerically, in terms of data, we really had more in the way of violent protesters and people who were seeking to overthrow the system, bombings and things in that period in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and so forth, than we have even today. It was a period of things that were very unsettling. You had a country which those of us who grew up in the 1950s seem to think America always wins, America always does the right thing. We had a country in what I call the mid-century moment, those years during and just after World War II, when you have an awful lot of a very high degree of it's the high years of high marriage, the years of the baby boom, of large numbers of children, and in an increasingly prosperous society, you have a rising birth rate, which goes against most historical trends. You have maximum degree of participation in organized religion. There's an idea that I think many of us had that, America used to be, a colonial period, early republic, everybody went to church, and then
Right.
fewer people do. That's not really true, actually. There were many loose ends and free wheels in American society in the 18th and 19th and early 20th century. You get a high point of participation in organized religion in the 1950s, in that period, in that mid-century moment. We take that to be the ordinary America. It really wasn't. And we had also in that mid-century moment, we had great popular culture that was aimed at everybody. It was universal popular culture. It was appropriate for children. It was appropriate for middle-aged people, and so forth. It didn't, have distinctions between Catholics and Protestants and Jews, although you had significant differences in religious observance and practices of many people in those groups in those years. You have a sort of homogenization of American life, and that popular culture comes in with, radio in the 1920s, talking motion pictures, movies in the 1930s and 40s, television in the 1960s and 70s partakes in that. And one of the things in my book, Our Country is Shaping America from Roosevelt to Reagan, that I thought was interesting is that you have those two presidents are sort of masters of the popular culture of the time. Franklin Roosevelt famously on radio, the fireside chats, getting to know people and appearing in the newsreels that were part of the movie shows, the picture shows that people saw at the movie theaters. So, and they're universal. I mean, one of my favorite statistics is America in the 1930. That was a year of some economic distress. It was a year in which there were census told us there were 121 million Americans, I think, 121 million Americans. What was movie attendance? Movie attendance was 100 million every week.
It's hard to think about that. Yes, it's what. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Everybody went to the movies every day. 1950s and early 60s television. What were the ratings? Just about everybody was watching television. They were watching NBC, CBS, ABC, the three networks that were the only networks that during most of that period were showing television and so forth. And one of the things that we've seen that's made a difference, and that was part of the mid-century moment. And President Reagan had made his career in all of those three popular cultures, in radio, in the movies, in television. He speaks the language of the popular culture. And you have a period in which presidents of both parties are reelected in landslides. That's contrary to most of American history. Why does that happen? And the answer is that you have an electorate that is used to a universal popular culture, that has had a personal experience of the depredations of the Depression of the 1930s, of the World War of the 1940s, that lived through depression and war. And when they get a president who seems to produce peace and prosperity, who seems to prevent another depression, another war, they reelect him by a landslide margin. They don't necessarily vote for his party down the line. So you get Eisenhower in 1956, Johnson being reelected for the record of the Kennedy-Johnson administration in 1964, President Nixon reelected in 1972, President Reagan getting 59% in 1984. And he's the last one that does it. Why is that? Because we don't have an electorate that remembers the Depression and the World War II anymore. That by 1984, they're really a much less dominant part of the election. And President Reagan talks in his final farewell address to the people about how the popular culture and the movies are not presenting a positive picture of America, and that we're not telling the story of the strengths of American history, as he thought we should. And I think that was a very solid point. We have not had a landslide reelection since. The first President Bush is elected in 1988 with 53.4% of the popular vote, carries 40 states. No president since then has gotten 53.4% of the vote. No president has carried 40 states. We are back to where we were in the 1880s, the 1868 to 1894 period, two equally balanced parties with very strong antipathy towards the other side, strong partisanship, difficulty of compromising on issues because each party has hopes they're going to win the next presidential election and win the Senate and the House at the same time. So why compromise in the meantime? We're in a more normal period. The mid-century moment was the moment of my childhood. In my adolescence, you could see it breaking up. We could see, I mean, one of the works I did for Peter Hart as a pollster in the 1970s was looking at media and the media environment and how we were getting a fragmented media environment. You didn't have everybody seeing the same movie, everybody watching one of the same three television networks. You had the separate teenage rock and roll. You had separate, country music stations. You had separate different kinds of television that people were watching, and you get the cable channels with hundreds and hundreds of options for people. And that's more like the America historically. Historically, we weren't a unified nation. We were a nation with multiple cultures and multiple attitudes from the time of the colonial experiences. The colonies that were set up, they were different, those colonies. You had New England colonies set up by Protestant Calvinists. You had Virginia, Maryland, set up by Carolinas by Anglicans. You had Maryland set up by Catholics. Pennsylvania set up by Quakers. You had this, David Hackett Fisher explains in Albion Seed, different kinds of people from different parts of the British Isles bring different cultural practices to different parts of the United States. Those differences are visible today. They were sort of elided over during the mid-century moment. We kind of thought they were irrelevant, going to no longer exist. Didn't really matter. They're with us again. And that's kind of my vision of American history. And one of the reasons I got into the Glorious Revolution and the book, Our First Revolution, is that it was by advancing guaranteed liberties, by advancing free market capitalism, by advancing toleration of religious and cultural diversity, by advancing struggles against hegemonic tyrannies abroad. They help set in motion so many of the things that I think have made America great. And that's something that I've been trying to chronicle and keep thinking about.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest is noted author and commentator Michael Barone. He's also a cartophile. I think that's how you say it. Loves his maps. And we've reached the point on the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Mr. Barone, are you ready?
Well, I'm as ready as I can be. Okay.
This isn't like the McLaughlin group. You don't get the questions ahead of time, right? What was your first job?
My first job, I think, let's see, what was my first job? I guess I would have to say working in the Verner's Ginger Ale Factory in Detroit, Michigan in the summer of, I guess, 1963 and 64. Also working at a welding shop in Madison Heights, Michigan. Summer jobs. Almost made mowing the lawn look good.
What was your first concert?
First concert? That's a good question. They didn't have things like teenage music concerts when I was young. I wouldn't have thought of going to an Elvis Presley concert, I guess. I think it must have been some symphony concerts of some kind in Detroit or Rochester, Michigan.
Do you remember the first time you heard the Beatles?
Well, I suppose it would have come, I think, before the Ed Sullivan Show appearance, which is February 1964.
February of 64.
I would have heard them on the radio because when I drove the car, I'd have the top 40 radio things on, stations on the buttons that you pushed. And so I would have that. And driving back and forth from New England, from college and law school across the Canadian border, and then into Michigan, that was a 14-hour drive. So I listened to a lot of radio in that period.
If you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
Any book.
Any book.
Well, I think it's If there'd been a National Book Award in about the years 1609, 1610, there would have been two strong competitors for it that I think still it would be remain competitors in my mind as an answer to that question. They are also the only books, I think, that the young Abraham Lincoln had available to him to read, and that's the King James Bible and the collected works of William Shakespeare. How would you like to judge the National Book Award for that year? Geez, we got a couple of really strong entrants this year.
This one's even tougher, perhaps. If you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
Oh, my goodness. I'd have to say now the signing of the Declaration of Independence.
Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record to chat about anything, whom would you choose?
Oh, that's difficult. I've already had dinner with some of the people
All right.
that I might suggest as answers to that question. Well, who could I have dinner with? I mean,
I'll tell you very quickly, the overwhelmingly most popular answer is Barack Obama.
really, no, I would not pick President Obama. Talented person, obviously, and knows many things that are of interest. But no, I think back when my first answer is I'd like to be present at the dinner in December. I want to go back in time to December 1900 to the governor's mansion in Albany, New York, where the outgoing governor and vice president-elect is hosting a traveler from England who's just been elected the member of parliament from Oldham. And that's a dinner between Theodore Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. It turns out they didn't like each other. I think they were too much of the same type.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I agree with that completely.
When
too much of the same people.
When Theodore Roosevelt, as an ex-president, went to England in 1910, he pointedly did not book dinner with Winston Churchill, who was a younger man. Yeah, that's the dinner I'd like to be at, and I've never seen an account of what exactly the conversation at that dinner. I'm not sure that even Martin Gilbert in his biography of multi-volume biography of Churchill, or that
Morris.
Edmund Morris on Theodore Roosevelt have ever dug out what was said at that dinner.
Have you ever met or had dinner with the current president?
No, I've never met Donald Trump. It's interesting. I've met every president set eyes on, let's put it that way.
Right.
Every president from President Johnson to President Obama and also President Biden. But no, I don't even knowingly have ever set eyes on Donald Trump personally.
As a political historian, this is my last question. I'll leave you alone. As a political historian, political commentator, which surprises you more? Trump's win in 16 or Trump's win in 24?
It surprised me more Trump's first win in 2016. I mean, that was threading a needle, winning those electoral votes by a very small margin, and the supposedly blue wall, which wasn't really that important. Wisconsin had been very close in previous elections.
Right.
In 2004 election and so forth. So, and Michigan and Pennsylvania had been close. So the idea that these were impregnably Democratic states wasn't, but the fact that Trump won all three of them and had to win them, no, it was against the odds. I mean, I guess Nate Silver's 538 gave it 29% chance of winning. And I think that was that was probably a pretty sensible calculation.
Do you remember your initial reaction when you were watching, Fox or CNN or ABC or listening to whatever you do when someone said, President-elect Donald Trump? Can you bring
I
yourself
could see it. I could count the numbers and feel it. I mean, I was watching it. I had been on election night broadcasts for the 96 through 2012 for Fox in various ways, shapes, and forms. It had done on-air commentary and so forth. And then 16 was the first election since 92 that I wasn't doing an election night broadcast. And I did it for CB. I did some off-air, but on set analysis in the elections from 74 to 80. So I was familiar with that. Yeah, I mean, I started seeing the numbers at, the 9 o'clock, sometime approaching 9 o'clock Eastern in 2016, I could see that there was a really great chance that Trump was going to win. And by 10 o'clock, it was obvious that it had happened, and people were starting to say that. But I think sometime around 8:45, 20 of 9.
Most astonishing victory in your lifetime at that level?
Well, I suppose it was that one. I mean, we went through, how many days was it before we, for certain, that George W. Bush was elected president in 2000. We had that close election. You had the 1960 very close election. You had, I'd say the biggest surprise, I was on the set at CBS sitting at Leslie Stahl's feet, literally, in 1980. And they had President Ford come into the set, and I had to move aside for President Ford. It was at that point former President Ford, to give a comment on Reagan winning that night. That was pretty astonishing. We had not expected that one to be so close. And in fact, I talked to the pollsters, Pat Cadell for Carter and Dick Wirthlin for President Reagan, President Carter, President Reagan, afterwards, and they both said basically opinion moved over that weekend.
Yeah.
You had the single presidential debate the week before, and I remember it as being a Thursday, but the last time I put that down in printer, I had to fact check myself, and I think it wasn't Thursday, but I'm not sure which day of the week it was as I'm speaking to you. And you had a big movement over the weekend. I think basically because people concluded were ready to vote against President Carter, and they were concluding that President Reagan could be an acceptable president. Even at what then seemed to be an advanced age, but now seems to be prime age. So it's that was sort of surprising that it was such a large victory and by such a wide margin.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies. We are an Indiana-based public relations enterprise. We are also a federally certified, veteran-owned small business. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Today, we are very grateful to have one of my all-time favorite TV commentators and authors, Michael Barone. We discussed the Glorious Revolution, a little bit of modern politics, some history, of course. We're very grateful for your time, Mr. Barone. Thank you so much for being a part of the podcast.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.